Hey, it's Chris Nicholas here with PetaPixel, and we just attended the new iPhone 15 launch here at Apple Park. So we got to see the new iPhone 15, 15 Pro, and 15 Pro Max. And what we want to do today is talk about the features that really interested us, that we're really curious about, and also what we want to test going forward. Now, right off the bat, the first thing I want to talk about, we've seen 48 megapixel Apple Pro RAW files before on the iPhone 14 Pro, Pro Max, but what we now have is very interesting. We've got 48 megapixel RAW files, but we also have a 48 megapixel HEIF, however you want to say it. This is nice because we all have room to push and pull, but we do save a ton of space. The next thing I want to mention in that same regard, actually, it was pretty slow on the 14 when you were trying to take 48 megapixel RAW files, especially in a row. There was a fair delay that you had to wait. That's honestly much quicker now. I mean, there's very little delay in between shots. So I want to play with that further when I do finally get an iPhone 15 Pro and Pro Max to play with, but that did seem cool. Here's another thing that's really interesting about resolution. So before, when you were shooting on the main camera, that 48 megapixel quad Bayer sensor, you would get an output of 12 megapixel files. What's interesting now, though, they up that resolution. So they're still doing the combination of multiple photos at 48 megapixels that are outputting at 12, but they're also taking one frame at full 48 megapixel resolution, and then they're combining the two together. We're getting 24 megapixels. Now, I really want to see if that's going to improve image quality going forward. I'm very curious about that. Okay, so let's talk about lenses next. So the iPhone 15 Pro, the iPhone 15 Pro Max, they both have an ultra-wide 13mm lens. Is it the same as the 14s? I think it is, I suspect it is, but we'll want to test that further. Now, what is also interesting, now they've added a 28mm equivalent lens and a 35mm equivalent lens. These are still going to be 12 megapixels. Again, we are basically cropping the main camera. That's cool. But another interesting difference now, if you go to the iPhone 15 Pro, you're going to get a 77mm telephoto lens. Is that the same as the previous cameras? Again, I suspect it is, or at least very similar. But of course, the big change now is when you go to the iPhone 15 Pro Max. Now we're getting a 5 times 120mm equivalent range. So Apple decided not to go with a periscope lens like you'll see on the Samsung. What they decided to do was a tetraprism, just to give you that folded optics and a little bit more distance to make that telephoto range work. Now, we have seen this before on other brands. Looks like maybe Apple's playing a bit of catch up here, but I definitely want to test out that lens and just see what kind of results I get. Now, this new lens is 12 megapixels, it's an f2.8 aperture. We should get some pretty nice shallow depth of field stuff without even having to use the portrait mode. That's pretty interesting. I'm eager to play with it, see what kind of compression we get, but this is a nice step in the right direction. Now, we have seen this before. I mean, Samsung's using a slightly different system, a periscope system, but we have seen this tetraprism design that Apple's using on the iPhone 15 Pro Max before with other competition, so maybe Apple's playing a bit of catch up here. Now, while we're on the topic of telephoto lenses and portraits, first off, I just want to see if the iPhone 15 can do portrait mode with depth mapping in an even more convincing way than the iPhone 14 series did, which did a much better job than the iPhone 13 series did. Now, another interesting thing here, you don't have to decide to use portrait mode right off the bat. What's very cool now is if you're shooting something with a portrait-based subject detected, the iPhone 15s will actually automatically save the depth map information. What this means is you can go afterwards and then decide, oh, okay, I want to use portrait mode. I want to create a softer background. I can also choose to change my focus. I could go to a person in the background or click back to a person in the foreground. So this is a fun feature. It's got a lot of potential. I definitely want to play with that. So of course, another big feature that you all know about now, it's USB-C connectivity, which is great, 3.0, it's nice and fast. And one thing that this unlocked that we got to see was now being able to tether to Capture One, for example, shoot RAW files and have them go right to the computer, right to large monitors. One thing though, we asked about flash sync speed. We still don't have those numbers yet. So that's another thing that I really want to test going forward. What kind of flash sync speed will we get on this sensor, on the main camera, on the telephoto camera? How fast is it going to read out? I really want to know that. Now, a lot of the questions we've been asking, Apple's been very forthcoming with the information, which is great, but night mode is something that I was very curious about. I mean, Apple does have a night mode, but it's a little bit annoying to use sometimes, even just trying to select it properly. And the results, I still feel like the competitor's doing a better job. So with the iPhone 15, they're saying that night mode is improved, but what does that mean? That's something I really want to test and find out. So I'm looking forward to that when I have an opportunity to play with the iPhone 15 Pro and 15 Pro Max going forward. That's what I want to test. But let's also find out what Jordan's curious about when it comes to video.
All right, so for video, the biggest thing I'm excited about with the 15 Pro and 15 Pro Max is Apple's releasing their own log profile. Now, other third-party companies have released log profiles for iPhones, but they've been kind of reverse engineered. This is a first-party option that's going to have access to all the information that this sensor can actually deliver. And I'm really looking forward to working with that to increase the dynamic range and flexibility on post. But also, I don't know if you've heard, the big deal is Apple ditched that lousy Lightning connection. Finally, and that's a big deal for videographers, because a few generations back they released the ability to record ProRes video right into the phone. The problem was these are huge files and it took forever to get them off with that Lightning connection or like transferring them through Wi-Fi. It was a huge pain. So now that we've got this USB-C port, we can actually plug that right into an SSD and deliver ProRes 4K 60 frames per second with HDR right to the hard drive. That's going to make this actually an option that some people might use on high-end productions. So I don't know if you remember a couple of years ago when the 13 Pro was announced, I would say like a third of the demonstration was dedicated to their new cinematic video mode, and we looked at it and it was terrible. And I've heard it got a little bit better in the 14, but you wouldn't know that from their press conferences because they did not mention it. And again, this year they didn't talk about it. I've heard that the cinematic mode is actually quite a bit better. The depth mapping is a little less obvious than it was before, but I really want to test that, and that's something I'm going to do when I get the camera in my hands. Now this is just a quick video that I'm going to throw together in my hotel room as soon as we leave this place, so I definitely want to hear some of your questions so we can address those in the full review, but also we have our podcast where we love to answer your questions. We'll be looking at some of those and answering them on the podcast there as well. We are going to get some hands-on time with the 15 Pro, 15 Pro Max, and we will be bringing a comprehensive review soon, so you're going to want to subscribe to check that out. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you all soon with more on PetaPixel.